It was a calm Tuesday morning when a woman named Lena Torres pulled her car into a small diner parking lot on the outskirts of the city. She wore a plain gray hoodie, jeans, and sneakers, blending in easily with the crowd. To anyone watching, she looked like any other person grabbing breakfast before work. What no one knew, though, was that Lena wasn't just anyone. She was the director of the FBI. For weeks, she had been quietly working on a secret operation. Her goal wasn't to chase criminals or hunt down fugitives this time. It was something different, something that mattered deeply to her. She wanted to understand how regular people, especially women and minorities, were being treated by local law enforcement. She had read the reports and complaints, but reading words on paper wasn't enough. She wanted to see it for herself, how officers acted when they thought no one important was watching. So she decided to go undercover. No bodyguards, no badge, no high-profile treatment. Just her, alone, living as an ordinary citizen. Inside the diner, she sat by the window with a cup of coffee and a plate of eggs. The place smelled of butter and toast. A few people chatted quietly in their booths. Outside, she noticed 2 police cruisers drive by, sirens off, just rolling through the street. She didn't think much of it. She was used to seeing police patrols, and today she wanted to stay completely unnoticed. After finishing her breakfast, she paid the bill in cash, thanked the waitress, and stepped outside. The air was crisp, and she took a moment to breathe it in. But as she approached her car, she saw 2 officers walking toward her. One of them, a tall man with sharp eyes, looked tense. The other was younger, trying to keep up. "Ma'am, can we talk to you for a second?" the tall officer said, his hand already resting on his belt. Lena stopped, slightly confused but calm. "Of course, officer. Is something wrong?" He glanced at his partner and then back at her. "We got a report about a woman matching your description. Someone said a suspect left a nearby store without paying. Mind telling us where you've been this morning?" Lena kept her tone even. "I was right there," she said, nodding toward the diner. "I just had breakfast. Maybe there's a mistake." The officer's expression didn't soften. "Do you have ID on you?" Lena paused. As part of her undercover test, she'd intentionally left her badge and ID locked in her glove compartment. She wanted to see how officers behave towards someone without credentials to prove who they were. "I don't have it with me," she said. "But if you call the diner, they can confirm I was just there." The younger officer looked unsure. "Maybe we should check with the manager," he said quietly, but the taller one ignored him. "You don't have any identification and you fit the description. That's enough for us to ask a few more questions." Lena nodded slightly. "That's fine. You can ask me whatever you need." Her calmness seemed to irritate him. Maybe it was the way she stood straight, her voice steady. She didn't act scared, and some officers didn't like that. He took a step closer. "Why are you acting so calm if you didn't do anything wrong?" She tilted her head. "Because I didn't." By now, a few people from the diner had stepped outside, sensing tension. A woman near the door whispered to her friend, "She didn't do anything. I just saw her eating here." But the officer didn't seem to hear or care. "Turn around," he ordered suddenly. "Hands where I can see them," Lena frowned. "Officer, you're making a mistake." "I haven't done—" "Hands up," he barked, cutting her off. His partner looked uneasy now. "Do we really need to cuff her?" he asked quietly. "Do it," the taller one snapped. "She's resisting." Lena exhaled slowly. She knew this was crossing the line, but she also knew this was exactly the kind of moment she wanted to witness firsthand. How power was used when people thought no one was watching. She turned around, raising her hand slightly. The officer grabbed her wrist roughly, twisting her arm behind her back. She winced but stayed silent. "You don't have to be rough," she said softly. "Then stop resisting," he muttered, though she hadn't moved at all. By now someone had pulled out a phone, recording the scene. A few onlookers shouted, "She didn't do anything!" But the officers ignored them. The younger one cuffed her wrists tightly. She could feel the metal cutting into her skin. The older officer pressed her against the hood of the car, his voice full of anger. "You think you can talk back to me?" Lena turned her head slightly, her voice still calm. "You're supposed to protect, not humiliate." That sentence hit him like a challenge. His jaw tightened. Without thinking, he shoved her harder against the car. "Don't talk to me about how to do my job," he growled. The crowd gasped and someone shouted, "Hey!" "You can't do that." The younger officer hesitated, looking torn between stopping his partner and staying silent. But fear won and he looked away. Lena's cheek pressed against the cold metal of the car. For a moment, she thought about revealing who she was and ending this right there. But she didn't, not yet. She wanted to see just how far it would go. Her breathing stayed slow. "You're making a big mistake," she said softly. The officer smirked, clearly not realizing the truth. "Yeah? I've heard that before." He opened the back door of the police car and pushed her inside. Her wrists still bound, she sat silently as the car pulled away. Outside, the crowd kept filming. People shouted that it wasn't right, but the car drove off, sirens now blaring through the quiet street. Inside the cruiser, the younger officer finally spoke. "You think she's really the one from that store?" The older one laughed. "Doesn't matter." She had an attitude. "People like her always think they're smarter than the badge." Lena turned her head slightly, looking at the reflection of his face in the window. Her voice was steady when she said, "It's not about being smarter. It's about being fair." He rolled his eyes. "Save it for the station." As they drove, Lena noticed how his hands gripped the wheel tightly. He was still angry, maybe at her confidence, maybe at himself. The young officer stayed silent the rest of the ride, glancing nervously at the back seat. When they reached the station, the older officer opened the door and pulled her out roughly. She stumbled but kept her balance. Inside, a few other officers turned to look. Some seemed surprised to see a woman being dragged in handcuffs without any obvious cause. "What's this about?" one asked. "Shoplifting suspect," the older one said, his tone casual, like it was just another routine arrest. Lena didn't say a word. She simply looked around the room, memorizing every detail. The desks, the faces, the small smirk on the man who had grabbed her. She wanted to remember how easily power could twist into arrogance. They sat her down on a bench. The cuffs were still on. Her lip was bleeding slightly from when her face hit the car, but she didn't wipe it. The officer who brought her in filled out paperwork like nothing unusual had happened. "You're lucky," he said without looking up. "You'll probably get out by evening if the store owner doesn't press charges." Lena studied his face. He didn't recognize her. To him, she was just another suspect. Across the room, a young clerk at the desk glanced at her and frowned. He had seen her somewhere before, but he couldn't place where. He leaned toward another officer and whispered, "Does she look familiar to you?" The other officer shrugged. "They all do after a while." Lena sat quietly, watching everything. She didn't shout, didn't demand her rights, didn't reveal her identity. She wanted them to keep showing their real faces. Every word, every move, every careless laugh, she was taking mental notes. The older officer looked back at her one more time and shook his head. "You people never learn," he muttered. That line hit her harder than the cuffs. Not because it hurt, but because it proved everything she feared about how some officers viewed the people they were supposed to protect. She looked up at him, her voice low but firm. "You're right," she said. "Some people never do learn." He didn't understand the meaning behind her words, but soon he would. That night, as the station lights buzzed softly overhead, Lena sat in silence, waiting. She knew what was coming. She knew once she made one call, the entire department would realize what they had done. But she waited, giving them just enough time to show exactly who they were and then to prove why she had started this undercover mission. In the first place, the sound of a buzzing, fluorescent light filled the small police station as Lena sat, quietly on the wooden bench, her wrists still cuffed. The smell of old coffee and paper drifted through the air. Time seemed to move slower here, like every minute stretched longer than it should. The officer who had brought her in was standing near the front desk, writing his report with a bored expression. Every now and then he'd glance at Lena, as if making sure she hadn't disappeared. His younger partner sat beside him, fidgeting. He didn't seem proud of what had happened earlier, but he also didn't speak up. Lena kept her gaze on the floor, though her mind was far from still. She had seen hundreds of officers in her career, brave ones, honest ones, and a few like these who had forgotten what their badge stood for. She wanted to believe they could change, but moments like this made that hope harder to hold on to. After nearly half an hour, a sergeant came out from an office down the hall. He was an older man, gray at the temples, with the kind of face that told stories of long nights and too much stress. "What do we got here?" he asked, looking at the two officers. The tall one replied quickly, "Shoplifting suspect. Matched the description. No ID on her. Tried to resist." Lena lifted her eyes slightly. "That's not true," she said calmly. The sergeant turned toward her. His eyes narrowed as if trying to read her. "You've got quite the attitude for someone under arrest," he said. Lena gave a faint smile. Or maybe I just know my rights. That made the tall officer snort. Yeah, that's what they all say. The sergeant sighed and shook his head. Book her and we'll sort it out later. Lena didn't argue. She let them finish their routine, answering questions with short, polite responses. She knew that at any moment she could reveal her real identity and end all this, but she wasn't ready yet. She needed to see what happened when an innocent person didn't have power on their side, when they had no title, no badge, no one to speak for them. They took her fingerprints, her photo, and placed her in a small holding cell. The air was cold and the light too bright. She sat on the narrow bench staring at the small barred window above her head. From inside, she could hear laughter from the main room. The same kind of laughter she'd heard too many times in similar buildings across the country. Officers joking to pass time, not realizing how much pain their carelessness caused others. Minutes turned into an hour. The younger officer eventually came by, standing outside the cell. He looked uneasy. Listen, he said quietly. I'm sorry about earlier. He shouldn't have been rough with you. Lena looked at him. There was guilt in his eyes. Then why didn't you stop him? She asked softly. He swallowed hard. You don't understand. He's my partner. Speaking up against him could cost you your job? She finished for him. He looked down. Something like that, Lena sighed. And what do you think it cost me? He didn't answer. He just turned and walked away. A while later, the door to the station opened and two detectives walked in talking about a new case. One of them stopped when he saw Lena sitting in the cell. His expression changed instantly. He leaned closer to his partner and whispered, Hey, doesn't she look familiar? The other squinted. I don't think so. Why? I don't know. I've seen her before. On TV, maybe. He brushed it off, but curiosity lingered. He walked over to the booking desk and flipped through the paperwork. When he read the name she had given, Lena Torres, his heart skipped. He remembered that name from somewhere. He turned to the sergeant. You sure this is her real name? The sergeant nodded without looking up. That's what she said. The detective frowned. You might want to double check. Meanwhile, Lena sat quietly in the cell, listening to every word. She could tell the realization was starting to surface. Someone was finally connecting the dots. The tall officer, the one who had arrested her, came back into the room carrying a cup of coffee. What's going on? He asked, noticing the detective's puzzled expression. The detective glanced at him. Where did you say you found her? Outside the diner on 3rd Street. Why? The detective hesitated. Because I think you might have made a big mistake. The officer laughed. Yeah, sure. Everyone's innocent until we prove otherwise, right? But the detective didn't smile. He pulled out his phone and opened a photo from a news article. It showed Lena, dressed in a suit, shaking hands with the president during a national press briefing. The headline above the photo read, FBI Director Addresses National Security Meeting. The detective looked from the photo to the woman in the cell. The resemblance was undeniable. His voice dropped. That's her. The room went silent. The tall officer froze, the cup in his hand trembling slightly. That's not possible, he said, though his voice sounded uncertain. The detective looked at him. You're telling me you arrested the FBI director? No one spoke for a moment. The sergeant stood up, his chair scraping the floor. Get the chief down here now. The tall officer muttered under his breath, This has to be a joke. But deep down, panic was already creeping in. He remembered every word he'd said to her, every shove, every ounce of arrogance he'd shown. And now it all came crashing back like a wave. The young officer stood near the door, pale and speechless. He looked like he wanted to disappear. The chief arrived 10 minutes later, his face tight with worry. He took one look at Lena and instantly knew. He had met her once before at a federal conference years ago. His voice was quiet but heavy. Open that cell. Right now. The sergeant fumbled with the keys, unlocking the door. Lena stood up slowly, her wrists still cuffed. The chief rushed forward, apologizing as he removed them. Director Torres, I had no idea. I'm so sorry. This is a terrible misunderstanding. Lena rubbed her wrists gently, her expression calm. Yes, she said softly. It is. The tall officer tried to speak, his words stumbling. Ma'am, we didn't know. She looked at him, and for the first time her voice carried the weight of her position. You didn't need to know who I was to treat me with respect. His mouth opened, but no words came out. The room was silent again. Every officer there felt the weight of what had just happened. The chief asked quietly, "Do you want to make a call, ma'am?" "We can—" Lena shook her head. "No need. They'll be calling you in about 5 minutes." He blinked. "Who?" "The bureau," and she was right. Less than 5 minutes later, the phone on the sergeant's desk rang. The sergeant answered, listened for a moment, and his face turned pale. He handed the phone to the chief without saying a word. The chief spoke for a few seconds, nodding quickly, apologizing again and again. When he hung up, he looked at Lena with deep embarrassment. "They're sending a team from Washington." Lena simply nodded. "Good. Maybe they can help you fix what's broken here." The tall officer finally whispered, "Please, Director, I didn't mean to." She cut him off, her tone still calm. "You meant every word. That's the problem." For the next half hour, the station was chaos. Officers whispered to one another, unsure what to do. The chief ordered everyone to remain quiet and professional, but fear hung thick in the air. They all knew this incident would follow them for the rest of their careers. When black SUVs finally pulled up outside, the sound of engines filled the street. Federal agents stepped out, their suits sharp, their faces expressionless. They entered the station, their presence alone enough to make everyone step aside. Lena spoke briefly with the lead agent, her voice low but firm. Then she turned back to the officers. "I'm not here to ruin lives," she said, "but I am here to change them. And after tonight, things will change." With that, she walked out of the station, the agents following closely behind. The door closed behind her, leaving the room silent. The tall officer sank into a chair, his hands shaking. The young one stood frozen, his eyes full of regret. The sergeant looked down at the desk, knowing that what had just happened would echo far beyond their small town. Outside, the night air was cool. Lena looked up at the sky, the faint city lights reflecting in her eyes. She had gone undercover to see how people were treated when no one was watching, and now she had her answer. She wasn't angry, not yet, but she was determined. Because what she'd seen that day wasn't just about her, it was about every person who had ever been treated unfairly simply because someone thought they could get away with it. And as the black SUVs drove away into the quiet streets, Lena knew this was only the beginning of what needed to change. The sun had barely risen the next morning when news of the incident began to spread through quiet whispers. Inside the small police station, tension hung heavy in the air. No one spoke above a whisper. The officers who had laughed the night before now avoided eye contact with each other. Every ring of the phone made someone jump. The chief sat in his office, head in his hands, the events of the previous night replaying over and over in his mind. He couldn't believe what had happened right under his nose. An undercover FBI operation that none of them had seen coming. And worse, his department had failed it miserably. When Lena had left with the federal agents the night before, she hadn't raised her voice or threatened anyone. But her calmness, her quiet authority had been louder than any shouting could be. Her words echoed in his mind. "You didn't need to know who I was to treat me with respect." Outside the office, the tall officer who had led the arrest paced the hallway. His face was pale, his confidence completely gone. The younger officer sat at his desk, staring at his hands, guilt written all over his face. Every time the older officer tried to speak, the words came out shaky. "They're not really going to press charges, right? I mean, it was just a mistake." The younger one didn't look up. "You think she'll just forget it?" "She said she wasn't here to ruin lives," the older man muttered. "Maybe she'll let it go." But deep down, neither of them believed it. Meanwhile, across town, Lena sat in a quiet hotel room, dressed once again in her usual work attire. The bruises on her wrists had turned faintly purple, and the small cut on her lip was healing. She stared at her reflection in the mirror, her thoughts heavy. She had gone undercover to see how ordinary people were treated, but even she hadn't expected the experience to feel this raw. There had been countless reports of officers using unnecessary force, of people being treated with suspicion for no reason. But being on the receiving end of it changed something inside her. It wasn't just about the policy now. It was personal. Her phone buzzed on the table. It was a secure line. She answered calmly. "Torres," a familiar voice spoke. "Director, the footage from the diner has gone viral. People are already sharing it online." Lena closed her eyes for a second. "That wasn't supposed to happen, I know. But someone from the crowd posted it before we could intervene. It's everywhere now. Reporters are asking questions. Lena stayed silent for a few moments. She had wanted to keep the operation quiet, to handle it internally. But now it was out of her hands. The world had seen what had happened. The rough arrest, the unnecessary force, and her quiet words afterward. "Let them talk," she finally said. "But no names from our side." "Not yet." "Yes, ma'am." After hanging up, she sat back on the edge of the bed. For a long time, she just listened to the sound of the city waking up outside the window. People walking to work, cars honking, life moving on, unaware that one of the biggest stories in the country was unfolding right there. Later that morning, she headed to the federal field office downtown. When she entered, the agents inside stood a little taller. Word had spread quickly through the bureau, too. Some looked at her with concern, others with quiet admiration. She was known for being tough, fair, and unafraid to do the work herself. But no one had expected her to put herself in danger this way. In the conference room, a few senior agents were waiting. One of them spoke first. "Director, we've received statements from witnesses at the diner. They confirmed you didn't resist or raise your voice once. Everything's on video." Lena nodded slightly. "Good, keep the footage safe. We'll need it for training and internal review." "Do you want to file charges against the officers?" another agent asked. She looked down at her hands for a moment before replying. "Not yet. This isn't about revenge. It's about accountability." Her voice was steady, but everyone in the room could sense the emotion beneath it. Meanwhile, back at the local station, the chief's phone hadn't stopped ringing. Reporters were calling. The mayor's office was calling. Even state officials wanted answers. By noon, the chief looked exhausted. When he finally called an emergency meeting, every officer in the building gathered in the briefing room. The room was quiet as he walked in, holding a folder. He didn't waste time with small talk. "We all know what happened last night," he said. "And we all know who that woman really was. This department is now under federal review." A murmur ran through the room. Some officers looked shocked, others just scared. The chief continued. "This isn't a witch hunt, but what happened was unacceptable. Whether she was the FBI director or not, no one deserves to be treated that way." The tall officer shifted in his seat. "Sir, with all due respect, we were just following protocol." "She didn't have ID, she matched the description." "Protocol doesn't mean disrespect," the chief snapped. "You handcuffed a woman who was calm, cooperative, and did nothing wrong. That's not procedure. That's poor judgment." The younger officer stared at the floor. The room stayed silent for a long time. Then the chief sighed. "We'll cooperate fully with the Bureau, and I suggest every one of you start thinking about why you wear that badge in the first place." After the meeting, the tall officer walked out without a word. The younger one followed him outside. "They're going to fire us," he said quietly. "Not if we explain it right," the older man muttered, though his voice lacked confidence. "Explain what? That we arrested the FBI director?" The older man didn't answer. Across town, the story had already reached the evening news. Reporters stood outside the police department, talking about a shocking case of mistaken identity and an ongoing federal investigation. Most of them didn't yet know the full truth, that it wasn't mistaken identity, but an undercover operation gone wrong. That night, Lena met with the Attorney General in a private meeting. The atmosphere was serious but respectful. He listened quietly as she recounted everything, from the moment the officers approached her to the second she left the station. When she finished, he said, "You've exposed something deeper here, Lena. This isn't about one department. It's about a pattern that's been ignored for too long." She nodded slowly. "That's why I did it. I needed to see it up close. And now I have." He leaned back in his chair. "What do you plan to do next?" She looked out the window for a moment. "We're going to rebuild trust, but from the inside out. But to do that, we have to face what's broken first." The following day, federal investigators arrived at the small police station. They didn't come to arrest anyone immediately. Instead, they began interviewing every officer, reviewing footage, and collecting reports. Their presence alone sent a clear message, and this wasn't going to be brushed aside. The tall officer tried to defend himself, insisting he was just doing his job, but every time he spoke, his words sounded weaker. The younger officer, on the other hand, admitted he should have stepped in. He said it plainly. "I was scared to speak up. I didn't want to lose my job." But now I see staying silent cost me something much worse. His honesty caught the investigators' attention. They took detailed notes, their faces unreadable. When they were done, the federal team packed up their files and headed out. The chief stood at the door watching them leave, knowing that everything about his department was about to change, whether he liked it or not. Back in Washington, Lena sat alone in her office that evening. The building was quiet. The city lights stretched out beyond her window. She opened a small notebook on her desk and began writing. Not an official report, but a personal reflection. She wrote about fear, about how power, when unchecked, could turn into something cruel, about how people lost sight of humanity when they put rules before empathy. She wrote not as a director, but as a woman who had lived what too many others had lived. When she finished, she closed the notebook and looked up at the photo on her desk. Her team, smiling, standing together during better days. She knew the next few weeks would be hard. There would be hearings, reports, press questions, and internal debates. But she was ready, because this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the kind of world she wanted others to live in, one where authority didn't mean dominance and justice didn't depend on titles. As the clock ticked toward midnight, Lena leaned back in her chair. The pain in her wrist had faded, but the lesson had not. The disguise was over, but the mission was just beginning. And somewhere, in that small town, 2 officers sat at home, staring at their television screens, watching her face on the news, realizing that the woman they had underestimated was now the one holding them accountable. The day after the incident, the small police station was quieter than ever. The usual chatter, the clatter of keyboards, and the low hum of conversation had vanished. Every officer felt the weight of what had happened pressing down on them. Nobody wanted to make a mistake that would draw the attention of the federal team still investigating the case. The tall officer who had made the arrest was pacing the hallways, running his hands through his hair. His partner sat at his desk, staring at the phone as if waiting for it to ring with bad news. It had been nearly 24 hours since the arrest, but the tension felt heavier than ever. Outside the station, black SUVs with dark-tinted windows pulled up, catching the attention of anyone nearby. Federal agents in suits stepped out, moving with precise efficiency. Their presence alone was enough to make the officers inside swallow hard and shift nervously. These weren't just any agents. They were here because the woman they had handcuffed was someone whose authority reached the highest levels of law enforcement. Inside the station, the chief gathered everyone into the briefing room. His face was tense, lined with worry and fatigue. "Listen carefully," he said. "Federal investigators are here to review our procedures, our reports, everything that happened yesterday. Cooperation is not optional." The tall officer swallowed hard. Do we tell them everything?" he asked quietly. "Yes," the chief replied firmly. "No excuses. No justifications. Just facts, and be honest about your actions." Lena, meanwhile, was sitting in a conference room across town with a team of federal investigators. She wore her usual professional attire now, her bruises mostly faded. She had a calm but commanding presence as she explained every detail, from the moment she arrived at the diner to the arrest and the way the officers had treated her. "I stayed calm the entire time," she said. "I followed every instruction I could, but they escalated unnecessarily. That's what we need to focus on. Why authority was abused when there was no need." The lead investigator nodded. "Your observations are going to help us build a full picture. And they're not just about procedure. They're about culture, about accountability. This isn't only about one department. It's about the message it sends to the public." Lena leaned back slightly. "Exactly. I went undercover to witness how ordinary citizens are treated when no one is watching. We need to make sure that fear or bias doesn't dictate how someone is handled. That was the entire purpose of this operation." Back at the small-town station, officers were being interviewed one by one. Cameras captured their statements and microphones recorded every word. The tall officer gave his account first. He recounted the events as he remembered them, but every word sounded weaker as he described the moment he had grabbed Lena's arm, twisted it, and pressed her against the car. "I thought she was resisting," he said finally, "but she wasn't. I realize that now. I overreacted." His voice faltered. The younger officer's turn came next. He spoke quietly, his guilt clear. "I saw what happened. I should have stopped him. I didn't. I thought if I spoke up, I'd lose my job. I didn't want to get involved, but I was wrong. I should have done something. The investigators nodded, taking notes. Thank you, one said. That honesty is important. You'll have the chance to reflect on this and learn from it. Meanwhile, Lena's story had spread across local news. Reporters called the station asking for statements. Some stories painted her as a victim, while others focused on the unusual circumstance of an undercover FBI director being handcuffed. The reaction was intense, and public opinion largely supported her. Many people were outraged that an innocent woman had been treated roughly, and applauded her decision to go undercover, to highlight issues within law enforcement. By midday, Lena had returned to the small town, escorted by federal agents. She wanted to observe the ongoing review herself and ensure that the investigation was thorough. The officers inside the station looked up as she walked through the doors. Some averted their eyes. Others watched nervously. They recognized that the person they had treated so poorly was now in control of the process and had full authority to hold them accountable. She didn't speak immediately. She walked past the officers, her gaze steady, and sat in the conference room where the federal agents had set up their review. The chief joined her, his hands wringing nervously. "Director Torres," he said, I want to apologize again. There's no excuse for what happened." She nodded slowly. "Apologies are a start," she said. "But actions need to follow. Policies need to change. Training needs to improve, and accountability must be clear." The chief swallowed. "We'll cooperate fully. Everything you need, reports, cameras, logs, it's all available. I want to make this right." Federal agents began to go over the station's procedures, comparing them to what actually happened. They reviewed the video from the diner, the statements of witnesses, and the reports filed by the officers. Lena watched silently, making mental notes about what was effective and what had failed. She could see patterns of overconfidence and bias, moments where fear or assumption had replaced careful judgment. At one point, she stood and addressed the officers who had been present during her arrest. "What you did yesterday isn't just about breaking rules. It's about trust. Every person who interacts with law enforcement is putting their safety in your hands. Do you understand that?" The tall officer nodded, his face pale. "Yes, ma'am." "I understand." The younger officer spoke softly. We do. I see that now more than ever." Lena looked at both of them. "Good, because understanding is the first step. The second is change, and the third is making sure it never happens again." The federal agents spent hours in the station, conducting interviews, reviewing evidence, and documenting everything carefully. The chief and senior officers observed, occasionally answering questions, always respectful and attentive. The atmosphere was serious, focused, and tense, but it was also productive. By late afternoon, Lena stepped outside the station to take a brief walk. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the street. She paused, looking at the ordinary town around her. People walking to shops, cars passing slowly, children riding bikes along the sidewalk. Life seemed normal, but she knew it wasn't. The incident yesterday had shaken this town, challenged the department, and sent ripples through law enforcement across the region. A local reporter approached cautiously, notebook in hand. "Director Torres," he said, "do you have a statement for the public?" She looked at him steadily. "Yes," she replied. "What happened here should remind everyone that no one is above accountability. Law enforcement has a responsibility to serve and protect, and when that trust is broken, it must be addressed. I hope this is the beginning of change, not just in this town, but everywhere." The reporter nodded and left, clearly impressed by her calm and measured words. Back inside, the investigation was wrapping up. The officers who had arrested her were asked to reflect on their actions. They wrote reports, detailing not just what they had done, but what they had learned. The federal agents made notes on their tone, their honesty, and their willingness to accept responsibility. Later, Lena gathered with the chief privately. "You have the chance to turn this into a learning moment," she said. "Policies, training, and culture, and all of it can improve if you take this seriously." He nodded solemnly. "We will. I promise you, Director. We will do everything we can to make this right." As evening approached, Lena left the station with the federal agents once again. The small town had quieted down, the sun dipping below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the streets. She felt a sense of resolve, knowing that the day's events were only part of a larger mission to ensure accountability, fairness, and justice wherever law enforcement interacts with the public. She didn't feel victorious or triumphant. What had happened yesterday wasn't something to celebrate, but she felt determined, knowing that the system could change if people were willing to face the truth, accept responsibility and act on it. And somewhere in the town, the officers who had caused the incident were left to reflect on their actions, their choices, and the consequences of underestimating someone whose authority they thought they could ignore. The night settled over the city, quiet, but not peaceful. Change was coming, slowly but surely, and Lina Torres, calm and steadfast, was determined to see it through. The next morning, the small town was quiet, but inside the police station, the aftermath of the incident continued to unfold. Officers who had once carried themselves with confidence now moved with caution. Every action felt heavier, every glance sharper. No one wanted to be caught making another mistake. Lina Torres arrived at the station with federal agents once more. This time she was not there to be detained or observed. She was there to guide change, to ensure the lessons from the previous day translated into action. The black SUVs that had caused panic just days earlier now seemed almost ordinary, but for those in the station, their presence still carried the weight of authority. Inside, the chief stood waiting, his face tired but determined. "Director Torres," he said as she entered, "we've reviewed the recommendations from the federal team. We're ready to start implementing changes." Lina nodded. She glanced around the room at the officers present. Some avoided eye contact, still uncomfortable with her presence. Others watched closely, listening to every word. She knew that for real change they had to see her not as a figure to fear, but as a reminder of the responsibility they carried. "Good," she said. "Change begins with accountability, but it doesn't end there. Policies can be rewritten, training sessions scheduled, but real change happens when officers reflect on how they treat people, every single person, even when no one is watching." The tall officer who had arrested her shifted uncomfortably. He had spent the past 2 days replaying his actions over and over in his head. The guilt was unavoidable now, the memory of her calm, steady eyes when he struck her like a weight he couldn't lift. I understand," he said quietly. "I realize what I did was wrong." Lina turned to him, her tone measured but firm. "Acknowledging it is the first step. Accepting it is the second. The third is committing to never repeat it. Do you understand that?" He nodded. "Yes, ma'am." The younger officer spoke next, his voice still low but steadier than before. "I didn't act when I should have. I see now that staying silent was wrong. I'll do everything I can to make sure it doesn't happen again." Lina nodded once. "Good. You're both accountable now. And accountability isn't just a punishment. It's a responsibility to do better moving forward." The chief stepped forward, holding a folder. "We've already begun internal retraining programs, updated our procedures, and will introduce mandatory de-escalation training. We want to rebuild trust, both within our department and with the public." Lina listened carefully. "These are good steps, but remember, policy changes are only as effective as the people who follow them. Training is important, but culture must change too. Respect, empathy, and fairness must guide every interaction." The officers nodded silently. The room was heavy with a mix of shame, relief, and understanding. They had faced consequences without even needing formal action yet, simply by recognizing the gravity of what had occurred. Later that day, Lina addressed the media outside the station. Cameras and microphones captured every word as she spoke to reporters, her calm and confident voice cutting through the tension in the air. "What happened here is a reminder," she said, "that authority must always be exercised with care. Every person deserves respect. Every decision matters, and we must hold ourselves accountable even when it's difficult." The crowd listened intently. Many nodded. Some held back tears, and others filmed her speech on their phones. For the first time, the town seemed to see the broader picture, that this wasn't just a single event, but a lesson for everyone who wore a badge. Meanwhile, inside the station, federal agents completed their review. Every officer had been interviewed, every piece of evidence examined. Lina watched as they prepared their report, ensuring that nothing was overlooked. The results would be shared with law enforcement departments across the country, making the small-town incident a turning point in policing practices and training methods. By evening, Lena returned to her hotel exhausted but satisfied. She took a moment to sit quietly, reflecting on the last few days. The physical bruises had faded, but the emotional impact lingered. She had gone undercover to understand how people were treated when no one important was watching, and she had seen the truth, both the failures and the potential for change. Her phone buzzed. It was a secure line from Washington. The Attorney General spoke. "Director Torres, your work here has already made an impact. We've received calls from departments across the country, asking for guidance on implementing similar reviews. Your operation has sparked a national conversation." Lena smiled faintly. "That's the goal. Change has to start somewhere. If even one department improves because of this, it's worth it. More than one will," he said. "And your approach, calm, deliberate, and humane, has shown that accountability doesn't require confrontation, but courage." Lena hung up, feeling a sense of quiet pride. She had remained calm even when confronted with aggression, had stood her ground without retaliation, and had made a difference without needing to escalate the situation. Her mission wasn't about personal recognition. It was about setting an example. The following week, Lena returned to the small town for a follow-up visit. The atmosphere at the station was noticeably different. Officers greeted her with respectful nods rather than anxious stares. Training sessions were already underway, and the chief walked her through the updated protocols and new reporting structures. "This is just the beginning," Lena said. "Consistency is key. Policies must be followed every day in every situation. People must feel safe and officers must act with integrity, even under pressure." The chief nodded. "We understand, Director, and we're committed to making it happen." She spent the day meeting with officers individually, discussing their experiences, their concerns, and their commitment to change. She emphasized empathy, patience, and responsibility, not as abstract concepts, but as concrete actions they could take every day. In the late afternoon, she met with community leaders and citizens who had witnessed the original incident. She listened to their stories, their frustrations, and their hopes. "Your voices matter," she told them. "This isn't just about law enforcement reform. It's about trust, respect, and justice for every person in this community." The citizens expressed their gratitude but also their cautious optimism. They had seen promises before only to be disappointed. Lena didn't make more promises. Instead, she showed them that change was happening, that accountability was real, and that the system could improve if people were willing to take responsibility. By the time she left the town, the sun was setting, casting long shadows over the streets. Lena stood for a moment looking out at the familiar surroundings, reflecting on the journey. She thought of the officers who had handcuffed her, the younger ones who had stayed silent, and the citizens who had watched in shock. All of them had played a part in a story that would be remembered, not for the violence or fear, but for the accountability and courage that followed. As she got into the black SUV that would take her back to Washington, Lena felt a sense of closure. The operation had been risky, uncomfortable, and unexpected, but it had worked. It had sparked change, provoked reflection, and reminded everyone, officers and citizens alike, that respect and humanity were not optional. She leaned back in her seat, thinking about what lay ahead. There would be more work, more challenges, and more situations where people's judgment could falter. But she had proven that courage, calmness, and integrity could make a difference. In the weeks and months that followed, the small town became an example for other departments. Training programs incorporated lessons from the incident, emphasizing empathy, accountability, and proper use of authority. Officers shared their experiences with peers nationwide, highlighting the importance of reflection and responsibility. And through it all, Lena Torres continued her work as the director of the FBI. She carried the memory of that day not as a mark of fear or anger, but as a reminder of why she had taken the undercover mission in the first place: to witness, to understand, and to inspire change. She knew the world wasn't perfect. There would always be mistakes, misunderstandings, and moments of injustice. But she also knew that one courageous act, one commitment to fairness, could ripple outward, creating impact far beyond what anyone could see. And for the officers who had handcuffed her, for the citizens who had watched, and for everyone who had learned from the incident, that day became more than a story of shock or mistake. It became a story of accountability, reflection, and the quiet power of standing for what is right, even when no one expects you to. Lena Torres returned to Washington with a renewed sense of purpose, determined to continue her work, not just for the Bureau, but for every person who deserved to be treated with fairness, dignity, and respect. The operation had ended, but its lessons would last far longer. A reminder that authority carries responsibility, that power must be tempered with empathy, and that change is possible when courage meets integrity. And in the quiet moments, long after the news crews left and the town returned to its routine, Lena allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. She had gone undercover, faced unexpected danger, and returned not just unharmed but stronger, ready to make a difference in a world that too often forgot the importance of humanity.